presentare il Geoffrey Quilley, che è professore emerito dell'Università del Sussex e che prima di giungere a Sussex ha avuto una brillante carriera prima all'Università di Leicester, dove ci siamo conosciuti, e successivamente, facendo un passo insolito per molti accademici, come curatore della sezione di arti visive, Fine Arts, del National Maritime Museum di Greenwich, un museo molto particolare, un po' come la National Portrait Gallery di Londra. Non sono molti musei che hanno, le nazioni che hanno un museo navale, e che lui ha trasformato completamente. Dopo questa trasformazione, che ha incluso tutta una serie di mostre estremamente interessanti, che non sto però qui a ricordare una per una, appunto è passato all'Università del Sussex, una delle università, tra l'altro, come Warwick, dove aveva studiato, dove la migliore storia dell'arte inglese è fatta, perché non è fatta a Oxford o a Cambridge, ma in questi due atenei. E quando dico la migliore storia dell'arte inglese, come quelli che hanno frequentato appunto la parte inglese del corso sanno, è una storia dell'arte inclusiva e soprattutto che guarda a molti attori delle vicende visive di questa nazione. E il professor Quilley è in larga misura responsabile proprio per aver aperto una finestra fino a quel momento non praticata, diciamo così, su quella che è la vicenda imperiale inglese e soprattutto però anche le parti, come dire, meno belle di quella vicenda imperiale, e è stato uno dei fondatori degli studi sul cosiddetto Black Atlantic. Io ho avuto modo di ricordare nelle mie lezioni più volte cose pubblicate dal professor Quilley, ma ricordo nuovamente, per chi ci ascolta e non è un frequentatore, diciamo così, del corso, non è uno studente, questi volumi che si sono succeduti con un ritmo strepitoso, invidiabile, e cioè partito con, ne cito solo alcuni, nel 2003 con un volume che ha curato insieme a Diane Critz, An Economy of Color, Visual Culture and the North Atlantic World, 1660-1830. Poi nel 2005 con John Bonehill, Conflicting Visions, War and Visual Culture in Britain and France, circa 1700-1830, e poi due memorabili volumi di cui è interamente autore, nel 2011 per Yale University Press, Empire to Nation, Art History, The Visualization of Maritime Britain 1760-1829, e nel 2020 British Art and the East India Company. Oggi, credo, dal titolo e insomma, da quello che ho visto, ci parlerà proprio di questo aspetto della East Company, che non è quello che noi a lezione abbiamo visto, perché noi siamo arrivati più o meno alle guerre anglo-indiane, mentre invece qui direi che la scelta di questo incredibile dipinto di George Chinnery, The Veranda, del circa 1842, credo che il professor Quilley andrà avanti soprattutto sul rapporto tra la Cina e l'Inghilterra e le guerre dell'oppio e quindi Canton. Fra l'altro, in primo piano ci rimanda, ora spengo, a questa questione. Quindi è con grande piacere che appunto rinnoviamo in questa occasione cose che facevamo normalmente prima del Covid, cioè inviti non soltanto a convegni, ma anche a lezioni di colleghi stranieri. Speriamo di superare anche la Brexit in questo modo. E sono grata appunto a Geoffrey Quilley per essere qui a parlarci della Economy of Human Life, Visualizing Empire in British Art, circa 1790 to 1840. Tiro su il PowerPoint del professor Quilley, se mi riesce, e gli cedo con piacere e gratitudine. Vediamo un po'. Sì, la parola.
Ok. Posto
Sì.
va bene? Perché è meglio che gli studenti, possibilmente, vedere la faccia della cara, no? O no?
Use this window by just clicking on the line.
Not from here, I can't. I can't see it on this screen.
Oh, that's fine then.
Okay.
We will pause by.
Okay, fine. Ok, grazie mille. Sono molto contento di essere qui a Pisa. Grazie per mi aver invitato. Ma mi dispiace molto che non parlo italiano abbastanza bene per fare la lezione in italiano. Allora essere in inglese. E vado a cominciare con questa pittura. This I will speak in English. I'm sorry, it doesn't feel right in Italy, but I will do that because it will be easier for me. I'm going to talk about, as Professoressa Sicca ha detto, the British art between around 1790 to 1840, the height of empire, and particularly related to the East India Company, the subject which I've recently published on, but on which there's very, very little scholarship. And to investigate how that changes our understanding of the history of British and European or Western art, in fact. So I'm going to be showing you a lot of things which you won't be familiar with, I'm sure. A lot of images which you won't be familiar with. Hopefully you might be familiar with this one. No? Okay. Turner's View of Greenwich. But the others almost certainly you won't know. And so what I want to do is to open up certain ways of thinking, well, why do we not know these images? Why are they not familiar? Why are they not part of the canon, what we think of, as art history in the standard textbooks? And what does that mean if we start looking at the history of art through the lens of something like the East India Company? What does that do to understanding of art history itself, of what we think of as the history of art, in particular, the history of British art, in relation to empire? Okay. And that, of course, implicates not just the East India Company, but other aspects such as the slave trade and the image of non-Western peoples, the image of the black in Western art, such as is the subject of the book which we're launching today. So I'm going to start with this painting by Turner, a view of London from Greenwich Park, showing London in the distance beyond the towers of Greenwich Hospital in the foreground, and with the deer in the deer park right in front of us in the foreground, and London almost eclipsed by the clouds and the smoke of business. And Turner exhibited this in 1809 at his own gallery in London, and accompanied it with a few lines taken from his own poem, his own ongoing poem, The Fallacies of Hope, which he placed alongside the picture, which I'll quote now. Where burdened Thames reflects the crowded sail, says, commercial care and busy toil prevail, whose murky veil aspiring to the skies obscures thy beauty and thy form denies, save where thy spires pierce the doubtful air as gleams of hope amidst a world of care. It's not the great verse. Turner was better as a painter rather than a poet, but it's interesting in terms of the way that he presents the view of London here. Greenwich is visualized as the degree zero of empire, zero meridian, okay, which of course it was and still is. At this moment, in 1809, under threat from war against Napoleonic France. But it's not seen, interestingly enough, as a centre of a territorial, state-sanctioned military imperial expansion. There's no mention of the war, either in the verse or in the image itself. There's nothing to do with war here. So what is Turner going on about? Instead, what he's showing us is London as a centre of a commercial nexus, a commercial empire, the empire of free trade. The Thames, burdened with the crowded sail of global shipping, is overwhelmed, and London's beauty and form denied, obscured, not by empire as such, but by commercial care and busy toil, which he says is murky, doubtful. And it's only the spires of the churches, of Wren's churches from the late 17th and early 18th century, which pierce the smoke and the doubtful air as gleams of hope amidst a world of care. So commerce is troublesome here. Placing commerce at the centre of Britain's imperial worldview, which is basically what Turner's doing here. Greenwich is the centre of the naval nation, of the maritime nation. Turner's painting, as with so much of his work, invites us also to focus on the sea and the maritime sphere as the crucial factor of modernity. As Daniel Defoe, the English writer of the early 18th century English writer, had pointed out almost a century earlier, trade and navigation were virtually synonymous terms for early modern Britain and the Western world. And so in taking up the invitation offered by this painting, I want to suggest here in this talk that considering the relation of art and visual culture to empire via the prism or via the lens of commerce necessitates also giving primacy to the sea as the medium, so to speak, of empire and modernity. The sea is absolutely crucial here, it seems to me. It not only emphasizes that empire was conducted by and across oceans, but enables us to think of the spaces of empire as connected ones rather than separate. Not in hierarchical binary terms of metropolis and colony or center and periphery, but in terms of routes, currents, circuits across network of changing fluid imperial spaces. And focusing likewise on commerce as a paradigm allows us to move away from thinking about empire as some sort of predestined entity and state-controlled and legislated project, and instead think about it as protean, as changing, as constantly in flux, improvised and localized. Empire wasn't the same in every space of the British Empire or the French or German or other European empires around the world. It operated differently in different localities, and that's really important to understand, I think. And therefore, we can start to think about art's relation to empire, not as secondary and illustrative of a given imperial history, placing imperial history first and then visual culture history alongside it as some commentary on it. But we can think about it instead as being involved in the same processes of encounter, exchange, movement, and flow. The empire implied in Turner's view of London was commercial and maritime, in which artists were fully engaged. And the primary murky commerce, trading in and out of the port and city of London, as seen here in the distance from Greenwich, was that of the East India Company, which by this date had far surpassed in economic importance Britain's other major imperial oceanic enterprise to the west of the Atlantic slave trade, which had recently been officially ended by the 1807 Act of Abolition. So I want to use the East India Company here as a way of thinking through the interconnectedness of the visual with the imperial during this period, and to draw out some of the implications of that, I hope, as well. We can start by thinking about an artist involved quite literally in the flow and extemporization of this form of commercial empire. An artist called Arthur William Davis, the son of a famous portrait painter, 18th century portrait painter, and a member of a family, extended family of artists working in the northwest of England. But Arthur William Davis, son of Arthur Davis, embarked on a voyage in 1783 in the East India Company ship Antelope as a passenger and unofficial draftsman on a voyage to Canton on the China coast. So he took the opportunity offered by East India Company expansion to join that ship as a way of opening up a career. So a sort of career move, an opportunistic career move that he's doing on the Antelope. And there's another story around that, which I won't go into, but it's quite a complicated one. Before it reached its destination, this ship, it was wrecked on the Palau Islands in the Western Pacific, south of the Philippines. So quite a way short of its destination, but in the China Sea, where Davis made drawings of the indigenous people, supposedly hitherto unknown to Western travellers. And so here we can see Davis's drawings of Palauan Islanders on the left and the right, or an engraving after his drawing of the so-called King Abathul on the right-hand side, which are very reminiscent of the ethnographic depictions of Pacific Islanders made on the voyages of Captain Cook in the 1770s. And so for comparison, I'm showing you William Hodges's portrait of two done in the early 1770s on the second voyage, Cook's second voyage to the Pacific, taken in the Society Islands. And we can see the way that these figures are represented in sort of three-quarter profile as interested, alert, but also with an attention to the detail of what they're wearing as sort of ethnographic signs. They're tattooing, the way that they're wearing jewelry or other accoutrements, their hairstyle, etc., which are just as important as representing the facial features and the facial profiles here. They're very much sort of in the manner of ethnographic or proto-ethnographic portraits. So Davis was aware of this. He would have come across Hodges's views in London in the 1770s, and he's working in the similar sort of fashion when he gets to Palau. Now, instead of returning to London after this shipwreck, after they repaired the ship and moved on, Davis instead made use of this misadventure, the shipwreck, to continue to India instead of going to London, via Canton, to pursue the expanding wealth and the population of the East India Company in India as a source for its portrait painting business. There was lots of money in India at this date through the East India Company and the increasing, rapidly growing population, Anglo-Indian population in India, and so opened up a potential market for portrait painting in particular. However, alongside portraiture, Davis embarked on a really ambitious project to record the characters and manufactures of India in a proposed series of 30 paintings intended for engraving that he later titled The Economy of Human Life, hence my title. And he described this series of 30 pictures in an extensive descriptive catalogue, talking about 26 of the proposed pictures in the series, which he published later. The series itself didn't come to fruition, it didn't happen, he ran out of money, but they were intended to be engraved and to be published and to present detailed views of Indian life and culture. The project appears to have been supported by Sir William Jones, the extremely important and polymathic Supreme Court judge in India, in Calcutta, and founder of the Asiatic Society in India, in Calcutta. The Asiatic Society was an organization arising out of the East India Company's increasing presence in India, and was devoted to the scholarly investigation of India's geography, history, grammar, rhetoric, agriculture, industry, science, music, architecture, poetry, medicine, plus whatever is rare in the stupendous fabric of nature. So that covers just about everything that the Asiatic Society was interested in. Every aspect of Indian life, culture, history, religion, etc., was the subject of its investigations. And it was a scholarly organization. It was centered on researching directly, with direct, empirical investigation, going to Indian monuments and investigating what their culture was. And I'm going to focus for a moment on Davis's series of paintings done as part of this project of the economy of human life, which at first sight don't betray such ambitious association as William Jones's sort of desire with the Asiatic Society to investigate every aspect of India's geography, history, physical and cultural life. Instead, they apparently, Davis's images apparently show bland forms of Indian labour. Okay, for example, this image of weaving muslin, which is one of the few paintings which was engraved. And this is in its hand-coloured engraving from about 1800. The painting would have been done in around 1793 to 5. So weaving muslin here shows a simple scene of a family of weavers at work, somewhere in Bengal, northeastern India, producing muslin. Muslin was one of the primary products, primary artifacts and materials produced in India, which was of interest to the East India Company and formed possibly the most important export for the East India Company throughout the 18th and early 19th century. Now, there's no obvious sort of allegorical meaning here. What you see is what you get. There's no parallel with, for example, Velázquez and Las Hilanderas, the weavers being like sort of three fates, for example, or echoing that the mythology of the Greek mythology. Instead, it echoes the scenes of rural cottage industry, familiar from the time of the 1770s and 1780s from contemporary artists such as Thomas Gainsborough, Francis Wheatley, or William Redmore Bigg. And I just show you a couple here of these sort of typical sentimental genre scenes being produced in their hundreds during the 1780s and 1790s by British artists. The difference is that these views of idealized English peasantry are generally set at least partly outdoors in an idyllic landscape, whereas Davis's scene is placed wholly indoors, with only the window in the top corner and the light source from the opposite side giving any indication of the outdoors. There's a much more concentrated attention, therefore, on the specifics of the materials and labour taking place. Even so, on the surface, this is a straightforward genre scene, one of a subgroup in the descriptive catalogue of treating of related occupations, which includes, besides weaving muslin, depictions of spinning, carpet weaving, as shown here, carpet weavers in Patna, and a final complementary picture, which I don't have an image of, showing the finishing, inspection and packaging of the muslin as a second stage to this view of its being made. So there's a temporary sequence going on here from the production in the workshop to its being packaged and then prepared for sale. And so there's an important sequence going on there, which has commercial implications as well as temporal ones. Despite the intensive attention to detail, there's little to alert the viewer to the complexity and philosophical and historical import that Davis claims for it in his written description of this painting. And I'm going to read this at length because I think it's really interesting in terms of the way Davis describes his own picture here. We have the descriptive catalogue, which is really useful to be able to think about, well, what is being shown here? And the way that he describes it is very revealing. The picture, he writes, represents the weaving of muslin, winding cotton thread, etc., and is an exact representation of a whole family so employed, painted on the spot at Santipur in northeast India, in Bengal. On the left of the picture is seen the grandfather. He was 73 years of age. holding a reel from which the person behind is winding off the thread. On his right hand is an earthen dish, in which is a shuttle, and other implements of his trade. In the foreground is one of his grandsons holding a spindle with his foot, having laid down a large reel which he managed with his hands. He's looking towards a door where the artist entered. On the right of the picture is another grandson, occupied as his brother had been, whilst his father is employed at the loom weaving a piece of muslin. About the room are a variety of articles used in the manufacturing. Fine linen, he goes on, was common in the time of Moses, for in Exodus, fine linen is ordered to be used as in part for the curtains of the ark, and for the dress of Aaron and his sons, fine linen and needlework, 1,490 years before Christ. And in other parts of the Bible where fine linen is mentioned, is it not possible that the linen, so-called, might have been brought from Hindustan? The labours of the Indian loom and needle have been universally celebrated, and fine linen is not improbably supposed to have been called Sindon, from the name of the river near which it was wrought in the highest perfection. See the 3rd anniversary discourse on the Hindus by Sir William Jones, Asiatic Researches, Volume 1. The beautiful muslin, which the ingenuity of our countrymen, with the most expensive and complex machinery, cannot surpass, that fabricated in the rude manner here depicted, the delicate touch and fine finger of the effeminate Hindu gives a degree of softness and flexibility to the thread which no machine the art of man has yet formed can at all equal. The first indication, therefore, that this is not a straightforward genre or descriptive scene is Davis's assertion that this depiction of the weaving of muslin is an exact representation painted on the spot at Santipur. He then tells us the age of the grandfather, 73, and that the grandson holding a spindle with his foot is looking towards the door where the artist entered. He emphasizes in 3 different ways that the picture is a document of an act of eyewitnessing, that he was there, and this is true. And moreover, one to which the figures depicted themselves bear witness. Indeed, he suggests that they are actively engaged in this process of representation, which is borne out in the image by the gazes of the 2 grandsons in the foreground, one looking up to the left where the artist entered with an expression of surprise, the other looking straight out of the picture to where the artist has now taken up his place to make his drawing. These reciprocal acts of looking between the artist and the weavers suggest an approximation also between their respective activities, the art of drawing, done by Davis, and the ancient craft of weaving, done by the craftsman in the workshop. This parallel is pursued in the subsequent elaborate description of the fine linen of India produced from the time of Moses up to the present day by the delicate touch and fine finger of the effeminate Hindu, which remains unsurpassed in its beauty as a fabric in spite of the rudeness of the machine used to make it. The muslin of India is for Davis an object of wonder, both because of its artistic process and also because of its immemorial biblical origin, a point reinforced by his direct reference to Sir William Jones's 3rd discourse. Now, in this discourse, the 3rd discourse, published in 1789, Jones mentions the fine linen in relation to the Shilpa Shastras, legendary ancient Hindu treatises on arts and manufactures, which were a vital source and a sort of mythical, almost sort of mythical source for the scholarship of India and the Hindu religion in particular, for the British and for the Asiatic Society. And Jones writes in this discourse as follows: "The labours of the Indian loom and needle have been universally celebrated, and fine linen is not improbably supposed to have been called Sindon, from the name of the river near which it was wrought in the highest perfection. The people of Colchis were also famed for this manufacture, and the Egyptians yet more, as we learn from several passages in Scripture, and particularly from a beautiful chapter in Ezekiel, containing the most authentic delineation of ancient commerce." So Davis, in his description of his own painting, has lifted Jones's words almost verbatim. And having asserted the documentary reliability and objectivity of the painting through its multiple eyewitness bases, Davis then appeals to the authority of Jones's scholarship, an objective scholarship, an empirical scholarship, lifting it as I say, almost verbatim, in order to establish the cultural relation of what he has seen and recorded in late 18th century India to the biblical record of life in the expanded region of India and the Middle East over 2,000 years previously. Jones's third discourse goes on in this vein to expand on the original linguistic and cultural connections across the ancient Indo-European world through his own study of Sanskrit, the ancient Indian Hindu language of Sanskrit. And he argues that Sanskrit has such an affinity with Latin and Greek that they must, he says, and I'm quoting, have sprung from some common source. And he suggests also that both the Gothic and the Celtic, those identifiably European idioms, had the same origin with Sanskrit, and the Old Persian might be added to the same family. In other words, he's suggesting that the ties between East and West, produced out of the modern company presence in Asia, reinstate a geopolitical heritage deriving from the biblical era, as though the East India Company's presence in Asia and that tie between Europe and Asia is somehow biblically defined. The British Empire in India could thus indirectly claim to be biblically sanctioned. At the same time, Davis's visual and verbal representations also support Jones's argument for the historical basis of the Bible. Jones was very interested in trying to emphasize that the Old Testament, in particular, the Bible, the Old Testament, was actually based in fact and wasn't just a sort of set of mythologies. So Davis is supporting Jones's argument for the historical basis of the Bible in equating the biblical account of weaving with his own personal observation, rooted in an awareness of the history of the art and manufacture of fine linen. Davis's citation of Jones's third anniversary discourse then offers an indirect way of placing his representation of weaving at the centre of a large network of geohistorical interests central to the company's, the East India Company's policy and its own image within South Asia, as one rooted in knowledge and beneficence and a sort of paternal guidance over the Indian population. Now, of course, weaving muslin was absolutely central to company business and profits. As Jones indicates, Indian textiles have been legendary since antiquity, both for their quality and variety. However, with the establishment of British power in Bengal in the 1750s and 1760s, the terms and conditions of textile production in India by indigenous and native craftsmen were drastically changed. As the historian of the East India Company, Nick Robbins, has described it, it was the wealth of Bengal's textile industry that first lured the company to Bengal, and it would be Bengal's weavers who felt the full force of the company's newfound market power after 1757, when the East India Company became a territorial power in India rather than just a merchant company trading out of seaports. From a situation of relative economic independence, Nick Robbins goes on, Bengal's weavers were forced into a position of near slavery, unable to sell to others and obliged to accept whatever the company's agents or gomasters would offer for their cloth. By the time Davis produced his study in the 1790s of Indian weavers, therefore, its invocation, its depiction of weaving as a self-managed cottage industry, was in fact a complete disavowal or denial of the effect on Indian weavers of the imposition of company monopoly on textile production. Any competition in this was forced out, and the weavers were compelled to sell at an underprice, to sell below the market rate to the company and its agents, who then went on themselves to make a handsome profit by selling the textiles produced at the market rate. And that's how they produced an excessive amount of profit, both for the company but also privately as well, and corruptly. Now, this exploitation of weavers by the company had been exposed sensationally by the former East India Company employee William Bolts in a 1772 publication, Considerations on India Affairs, in which he identified the treatment of the weavers as merely the most conspicuous and notorious symptom of a commercial system imposed by the company that was rotten to the core. Bolts here claimed that it was hardly possible I quote again, to conceive of the existence of such cruel oppressions and ruinous measures as have taken place in the Bengal provinces of late years, but particularly since the English East India Company are become the sovereigns of a rich and potent kingdom, and their government in Bengal a military as well as a civil government. And he goes on to detail the company's treatment of the weavers as Bengal as epitomising or encapsulating its system of colonial government based on unregulated commercial exploitation. Having established a system based on monopoly, he says, every kind of oppression to manufacturers of all denominations throughout the whole country has daily increased, insomuch that weavers, for daring to sell their goods, have by the company's agents been frequently seized and imprisoned, confined in irons, fined considerable sums of money, flogged, and deprived in the most ignominious manner of what they esteem most valuable, their castes. Weavers also, upon their inability to perform such agreements as have been forced from them by the company's agents, have had their goods seized and sold on the spot to make good the deficiency. And the winders of raw silk, called nagads, have been treated also with such injustice that instances have been known of their cutting off their thumbs to prevent their being forced to wind silk. So Bolts arrives at what was to become and would become in the 19th, and especially during the period of Indian independence in the early 20th century, a notorious account of Indian workers mutilating themselves, cutting off their own thumbs to avoid being forced into near slave labour by the conditions imposed by the company. Davis's picture, then, offers a very complacent, positive image of life under company rule, a blatant example of false consciousness. And in this sense, they might think about it as being somehow similar to images produced in the West Indies around the same time by artists such as Agostino Brunias, showing the African population, the forced transportation of Africans to the Caribbean here, as being a happy slave population, happy plantation slaves. There's no reference here to the actuality of brutal backbreaking and often fatal labour in the fields producing sugarcane. But at the same time, Davis's painting, its production within the context of commercial empire, imbues what would ordinarily be a subject of inconsequential banality with a complexity and depth of meaning that turns it instead into a study of anthropology, history, theology, and philosophy. And we can think about how those subjects in themselves have imperial connotations and are used for imperial ideological ends. I won't go into that now, but think about that anyway. So it turns this picture into something, ostensibly this is sort of the lowest of the low, and an image of labourers working in a colonial context producing cloth. Is not the subject that we ordinarily think of as something philosophical and historical, because those issues, philosophy, history, anthropology, etc., are themes that theoretically, in academic terms, in terms of academic theory, at this time, would be reserved for the highest genre of art, history painting. But this is not what we've got here. What I want to suggest then is that through filtering visual culture through the lens of maritime commerce, in this instance through the East India Company, the full weight of otherwise disregarded imagery such as this can be registered and can start to be understood, in which conventional genre hierarchies are overturned and the lowest form of subject matter assumes extraordinary significance, and also allows us to understand the similarly extraordinary novelty of Davis's project, which doesn't end there. For another aspect, another striking aspect of Davis's views of the arts and manufactures of Bengal is their almost obsessive preoccupation with materiality and productivity. As I mentioned, this is part of a sequence showing the temporal sequence between production and preparation for sale, for packaging. So there's a sequence going on there in terms of the production, the productivity, and the materiality, and its value, its worth. implicitly. And in this sense, these images differ markedly again from domestic genre scenes of rustic life. Weaving muslin is concerned less with the Indian labourers as types than with the process of creating the material that is a product of their labour. This is even more pronounced in other pictures in the series, such as the brazier's shop. I'll give you a couple of examples in the same series. The brazier's shop or the blacksmith shop, where the makers or sellers of goods are inundated by their own productivity. Look at the surplus commodities which are strewn across the floor. This is an empire of surplus commodity value that applies not just to commercial concerns of the East India Company, but to the vast proliferation of objects and commodities coming out of the expanding imperial world and being channeled via its shipping routes back to London and other major Western cities, often to be housed in a novel space of the museum, for example, such as the Museum of the East India Company itself, based in East India House in London, to begin with, and which now forms a major part of the V&A collections and the collections at Kew, or the Missionary Museum. And show you a couple of examples here. A Missionary Museum was created to display the trophies collected as a result of the Missionary Society project of Christian conversion across the Pacific, mainly the Pacific, but also elsewhere in the Caribbean as well. But the Missionary Museum was devoted to objects collected as a result of conversion of so-called heathen populations in the South Pacific. In Davis's image of the pottery, this surplus productivity extends to commodities not represented within Davis's series and of a more questionable morality. For the pot shown at the foot of the potter appears to be the same as that in an engraved cartouche that Davis produced at some time in the 1790s. There's no date on this, and it's not known what this image was for. But he produced a cartouche of tools and techniques for making opium. And the pot there in the centre seems to be the same as the pot there at the potter's foot, suggesting this is could be used for multiple purposes, but one of the purposes is certainly for the production and collecting of opium. Now, I was staggered when I first started researching this project because opium suddenly became really, really, really important. And that is not something I'd ever come across in an art historical context before. And so, again, it's one of these things which studying this area just opens up different historical trajectories, different genealogies for understanding where art history is coming from and where the absences are. And that's really crucial, I think. And opium is staggeringly important. Since the third quarter of the 18th century, the British East India Company had been cultivating opium in its Indian territories. It had been particularly around Patna, Benares, and Bengal, again in northeastern India. And they would convert vast tracts of land from a production of wheat or other grain for food and turn it instead into opium cultivation. So opium fields took the place of agricultural fields. And we can think about the implications of that in terms of what's been going on in Afghanistan, for example, ever since, in terms of the cultivation of opium. Well, it starts with the East India Company in the 1770s. And what they would do, the East India Company would produce opium in its northern territories for sale to private merchants in Calcutta, who would then ship it to Canton for sale to the Chinese market. Canton being the only European base for trade with China, is strictly regulated. Canton was the only place that the Chinese Empire would allow for the commercial interaction between Western merchants and Chinese merchants. And in Canton, the opium would generally be sold to Chinese merchants in exchange for tea or bullion. Tea, of course, the other major export and product coming out of China and India for the sale back in Europe and the West. By the 1820s, this commerce in opium had reversed the balance of trade between China and Britain, which was always a major concern for the East India Company, and reversed it decidedly in favour of the British. Because formerly, the demand for tea meant that the East India Company would buy tea from the Chinese with silver or gold bullion, and thus depleting their own silver stocks and their own silver reserves. But instead, by buying the tea with opium, they instead reversed that balance of trade, and indeed the Chinese would buy opium with the increasing demand for opium through the addiction to opium in their own country, would increasingly buy opium with their own silver reserves and their own silver bullion. As the historian Karl Trocki has put it, by the 1820s, opium had come to be the second largest source of government income in British India, regularly constituting about 15% of the total, which is an extraordinary sum. And he goes on, in addition to being a major source of revenue, it was also a major export, constituting the largest single item of export for the first 2/3 of the 19th century. By the middle of the century, opium was regularly about 1/3 of all exports coming out of British India, and thus by itself was a major prop of the colonial Indian economy. It had become too valuable a resource to abandon. For this reason, Rocky goes on, opium and its economy were fundamental to British imperial interests. Beginning in about 1760 or 1770, he goes on, opium began to affect every aspect of the European presence in Asia and to actually transform the environment. Though difficult to prove beyond question, it seems likely that without opium, there would have been no empire. Now, that's a big claim and a very contentious one. But it makes clear the importance of opium to such an extent that it would lead to the Opium War of 1839 to 42, which was a British-led assault on China in order to force it to accept free trade in the drug through its borders, and to lift its restrictions on trade, and particularly trade in opium. It also points to the importance, again, of thinking about empire via the maritime, via shipping routes connecting what conventionally are understood as culturally and historically distinct zones, and which open up perspectives on imperial history that are conventionally obscured. As I mentioned, even in histories, standard historical accounts of 19th century Britain, China and the Opium War receive very little attention. In standard art historical accounts, they are almost invisible. Yet Davis's passage from Canton to Calcutta, following his shipwreck in the Palau Islands, followed in reverse the route of opium from India to the China coast. 3 decades later, another artist, also little known to mainstream art history, George Chinnery, whose image was on the poster that you saw at the beginning, took the route of the country traders, as they were called, the private traders trading opium out of Calcutta to Canton. He followed the route of the country traders, so taking the opposite route to Davis, and their opium clippers in transferring his portrait business from Calcutta to Canton and the Portuguese settlement of Macau, which is where the East India Company and other European or other Western merchants operated out of Canton and Macau. Chinnery is an extraordinarily interesting artist, and I really recommend that you look him up if you get a chance. It's fantastically, it's a great story apart from anything else. Chinnery was supported artistically and financially, and he'd been in India since the early 19th century, since around 1810 or so, 1815, and had developed his career in India and then transferred it to Canton and Macau, supposedly to avoid debts. He was running away from creditors, apparently. So he was on the run and went and settled in Canton and Macau and got in with the East India Company traders or the independent traders and bankers there. And he was supported in Macau and Canton artistically and financially by leading British merchants there. William Jardine, whose portrait he painted, shown here in an engraving of the 1830s, and Lancelot Dent, the other major British or English trader in Canton and Macau. And he made portraits of these and other merchants, also including the fabulously wealthy merchants in Canton, the Chinese merchants who were trading, who were buying the opium and then distributing it within their own territory. He also produced sweeping panoramic views from the British merchants' sumptuous houses overlooking the Macau shoreline, often in a startlingly modern idiom. This is a really remarkable image, I think, the veranda of Mr. Matheson's house of the 1830s. I've come across very, very little like it in terms of the way it prefigures Degas or something like that. In terms of the composition, it's extraordinary, inventive. Or else expansive views of the bay, as shown in something like this. In 1842, he painted this picture, which you've seen already, on Dent's veranda, referring to Lancelot Dent, the merchant that I mentioned. Now, this again is a striking image. It's a highly original composition, is more akin to something like Manet's painting of modern life than the 18th century conversation piece tradition that forms its most obvious pictorial genealogy. And just for comparison, I show you here one of Manet's pictures of modern life, and sort of deriving from a conversation piece, but very much an image of modernity, versus Johann Zoffany's reworking of the conversation piece for his Anglo-Indian patrons in the 1780s. And Chinnery's painting seems to be much closer to Manet's than to Zoffany's. Painting and the context of the Opium War, and this is a painting in 1842. Remember, just right at the close of the Opium War, this 1839 to 42. The painting and its context have been thoroughly analysed by the art historian Patrick Connor in his exemplary monograph on the artist. At first sight, writes Connor, it's a pleasant, out-of-season relaxation, an illustration of Chinnery's famous remark that the servants of the East India Company spent 6 months in Macau, having nothing to do, and the other 6 months in Canton, sir, doing nothing. Beyond the veranda, in the distance, a Portuguese flag flies above the fort of São Francesco, at the northern tip of the Praia Grande. On the wall, a telescope and a barometer suggest the marine interests of the three figures. The mild sunshine slanting in beneath the partially rolled rattans illuminates the word China in the corner of a map on the wall. And I hope you can just about see those details. Light breeze is just sufficient to agitate the spiral of smoke from an incense burner on the extreme left. The informality of the occasion is emphasized by the antics of one of the dogs, although its performance fails to distract the gentlemen from their conversation. Yet, as Connor goes on to observe, there's more to this painting than meets the eye. The scene of early Victorian gentlemanly capitalism shows three figures who were centrally involved in the opium trade, and thereby fundamentally interested in the causes of the war, its prosecution, and from the British traders' perspective, its successful conclusion. Leaning nonchalantly on the balcony to the right is Captain William Hall, commander of the Nemesis, the ironclad steamship that led the British siege of Canton and the subsequent offensive along the east coast of China between 1840 and 1842. Reclining to the left is the French merchant J.A. Durand, and in the centre, the American William Hunter, who eagerly engages Durand in conversation. Both of these men had been trading between Calcutta and Canton since the 1820s. The location for this relaxed gathering is the balcony of the coastal villa of Lancelot Dent, whose trading house, Dent & Co., was, alongside Jardine Matheson & Co., one of the leading European companies trading out of Canton, dealing primarily in opium. It's therefore an British imperial, and more specifically, East India Company interest, based on a cosmopolitan commitment to a principle of free trade, shared across Western nations. I think the cosmopolitan aspect of this is important. William Hall is British, there's a French merchant and an American merchant. This is a joint effort based on a cosmopolitan commitment to the principle of free trade. shared across Western nations to which the Chinese had just been brutally bent through the naval power invested in Hull. On the table beside Durand is a cup of tea. Otherwise, there's no sign of any refreshment, liquid or otherwise. This is not a scene of convivial socializing set around the punch bowl or the hookah. Rather, the significance of the teacup is registered on the opposite side of the composition and the opposite corner of the room in the prominently placed single poppy. For the primary commodity traded by both of the merchants shown here, which the British government had instructed Captain Hall to defend militarily, was opium, which, as I mentioned, they traded mainly for tea for import to the European market. The merchants depicted here, then, were not company employees or officers, but private entrepreneurs. They were, however, intimately linked to the company, since their trade to China was in the most lucrative commodity produced by the East India Company in India, that is, opium. This context of the opium trade and the Opium War indicates something of the importance of Chinnery's painting, as well as its deep ambiguity as a visualization of empire. For the major problem with the opium trade to China, besides feeding a rapidly growing addiction among the Chinese population, was that since 1729, it had been illegal. But traders such as Durand, Hunter, and the massive corporations of Dent & Co. and Jardine Matheson were engaged in, with the collusion of Chinese customs and the Hong merchants in Canton, who profited handsomely, was a vast smuggling operation. So lucrative, first to the East India Company and then through the company to the British government, that it was economically indispensable. And the way it worked was that the company produced the opium in India, but didn't directly trade it to the Chinese themselves, but instead sold it to private merchants in Calcutta, who then, under their own independent steam, took it to China and sold it as part of, as a smuggling practice. And so the company neatly sidestepped any allegations of malpractice. So that when the Chinese Qing authorities, because this trade was was profiting Britain so massively to the expense of the Chinese economy, when the Chinese Qing authorities began a severe crackdown in the mid-1830s, leading to a stop in trade, a blockade of Canton, and multiple arrests in 1838, the British response to the disruption of free trade by their resident population there was armed intervention, most visibly and devastatingly in the form of Captain Hall and his joyfully named ship Nemesis. On Dent's veranda, then, both assumes a personal significance in the figures portrayed and in light of Chinnery's own immersion of the merchant community, own immersion himself in the merchant community as being part of that community. And interestingly, the poppy, the vermilion of the poppy, might well be a sort of autograph of Chinnery. He regularly resorted to using that vermilion, which was produced in China and India, as his sort of trademark colour, as trademark image. And it also alerts us to the ideological load invested in the ways that the scene is represented, particularly its emphasis, I think, on visibility, on the way that we can look out here. We're inside looking out. And here, this aspect of the expansive view from the house, together with the relaxed but urgent conversation that seems to be taking place among the men, assumes a status as a reflection of their far-sightedness. It's almost a sort of metaphor for their far-sightedness in their business interests and military interests, and as a naturalizing sort of validation or legitimization of the principle of free trade, underpinning both their individual and mutual business interests in the region, and also the wider empire and their place in it, as well as Chinnery's place in that empire as well. The clarity of the sunlight illuminating the scene indoors and outside is complemented by the objects placed on the wall, the map, the telescope, the barometer, which together constitute the technologies invested in the visual by which the British were able to overcome easily the Chinese forces, even though being vastly outnumbered by it. In particular, they relate to Hall's naval campaign, being instruments for planning, following, visualizing a route, and for measuring weather conditions so critical to naval voyaging. The map shown appears not to be based on any particular published map as far as I've been able to ascertain, but is carefully constructed in a deliberately loose fashion as though part of the casual conversation taking place below it, to show both the arena of the British campaign along China's southern and eastern coasts, and also the extent of the Qing Empire that had been forced into submission. None of the men look out at the view beyond them. On the contrary, Hall has his back to it conspicuously. But the telescope reminds us of the capacity to do so, and the barometer of the capacity for meteorological information, not just locally now, but across geographical space and predictively in the future in time. Empire in this scenario, and perhaps counterintuitively, is seen as a place not to look upon, but from which to look out. And dense veranda becomes a version of one of Bruno Latour's centers of calculation, zones of accumulation of knowledge and data through which Europe was enabled to act at a distance, as he put it, on the rest of the world. It's a center of calculation in which the invisible host, Lancelot Dent, doesn't even have to be present. And tacitly implied in his viewpoint is approval for the opium trade as an instrument of empire. Okay, I'm coming to the end. Thinking through visual culture then in terms of the routes, circulation and currents of commercial maritime empire also draws attention to ships as signifiers of early modernity. What Paul Gilroy, the cultural historian, and particularly a cultural historian of the Atlantic, as he's called it, has defined as a chronotope of modernity. As a living microcultural, micropolitical system in motion, the image of the ship, he writes, immediately focuses attention on the Middle Passage, on the circulation of ideas and activists, as well as the movement of key cultural and political artifacts. For, of course, the other outstanding economy of human life of this period, one which, like the Opium War or the East India Company, tends to be overlooked or erased in standard accounts of art history, was the economy of the slave trade. And Gilroy, in a discussion of J.M.W. Turner's painting The Slave Ship, going back to Turner again, produced around the same time as Chinnery's view of Dent's Veranda, of course. This is 1840, Dent's Veranda is 1842. Gilroy describes, in relation to this, Gilroy describes ships as the living means by which the points within the Atlantic world were joined, and we can also say that the Eastern world as well, or the Pacific world. But he's thinking about the Atlantic slave trade in particular, and the Black Atlantic. They were mobile elements, he writes, that stood for the shifting spaces in between the fixed places they connected. Accordingly, they need to be thought of as cultural and political units rather than abstract embodiments of the triangular trade. The ship provides a chance to explore the articulations between the discontinuous histories of England's ports, its interfaces with the wider world. Ships also refer us back to the Middle Passage, to the half-remembered micropolitics of the slave trade and its relationship to both industrialization and modernization. As it were, getting on board promises a means to reconceptualize the orthodox relationship between modernity and what passes for its prehistory. It provides a different sense of where modernity might itself be thought to begin in the constitutive relationships with outsiders that both found and temper a self-conscious sense of Western civilization. Conversely, at the conclusion of the Opium War, William Hall, the standing figure in Chinnery's painting, was standing on the deck of his ship, the Nemesis, the highest achievement to that point of the modern naval technologies of lethal warfare, on his way to devastate and massacre the garrison port of Zhao on China's eastern coast in May 1842. And he was standing on the deck and was struck by the picturesque beauty of the landscape he was about to bombard, remarking on its rich, luxuriant, well-watered plain, as he puts it, and curiously shaped blue-tiled roofs and remarkable hills. And then he resorts to a common trope or analogy of imperial landscape aesthetics, in which the assimilation of a colonial landscape is enabled through anglicizing or familiarizing the foreign environment. And he concluded that the panorama in front of him of this Chinese landscape powerfully resembled the prettiest parts of Devonshire. Devonshire, of course, being a very picturesque part of the English landscape, but not one that Sir William Hall was going to bombard. Sorry, William Hall, not Sir William Hall. He was knighted. Such assimilation of the landscape, in association with the modernity and technology of the ship of which Hall was commander, speaks powerfully of the similar familiarity of the comfortable conversational interior of Dent's Veranda. Placed in the Sino-Portuguese environment of Macau, looking out at the extensive coast and open sea beyond, with all that implies in terms of commercial and imperial potential. At face value, then, the celebratory and condescending tone of Chinnery's conversation piece, its unapologetic assertion of British or Allied Western righteousness in supposedly bringing the Chinese to book, to enacting a punishment upon the Chinese for daring to attempt to enforce their own laws within their own territory, and thus to contravene the mutable rules of the free trade game. This makes it in one sense an affront, a loaded and appalling statement of imperial arrogance and corruption, as was voiced about the war by the politician and later Prime Minister William Gladstone, who remarked at the beginning of the Opium War, "A war more unjust in its origin, a war more calculated in its progress, to cover this country with permanent disgrace, I do not know, and I have not read of." But perhaps that's where its problematic status lies, at least in part, together with its implications for art historical narratives. For its stark and brilliant modernity, as a formal piece of painting, a formal composition developing the genre of portraiture in remarkably innovative ways, represents also a politics of laissez-faire imperialism, in which morality is put out to the highest bidder, and which advocates a free trade ideology of such extremism that it sits very uncomfortably with orthodox art historical narratives based around, for example, the idea of art as celebratory, as a sort of celebratory index of national culture. Chinnery can't be identified with Britishness, for example, in the same way as Turner or Constable. But it sits equally uncomfortably with counter-narratives of modernism and modernity deriving from, say, Marxist critical perspectives. The view from Dent's Veranda is not one that's shared by dominant art historical discourses, and it instead speaks, brilliantly as a work of art, of alternative paradigms and frames of reference, which we can start to interrogate through the discourse of commerce and its complex, extraordinarily complex maritime and imperial implications. If it's possible to identify, as Paul Gilroy did many years ago, a cultural politics of the Black Atlantic through the mobile interstitial spaces of the sea, as he puts it, implicated in Turner's almost exactly contemporary slave ship, then we should also make room somehow for the equally virtuoso and modern pictorial idiom of Chinnery's view from his outpost in Macau, whereby both pictures can speak to each other as facets of an artistic environment in which empire as concept and practice was fully operative and deeply influential, and can also speak back to the painting with which I started, Turner's view of Greenwich, the degree zero of Britain's commercial empire. But the other paintings that I've shown you are kind of implied in what Turner's depicting here. In conclusion, it also points to an alternative genealogy or tradition of art history that we can think about, located within the world of commerce and corporate commerce, where Chinnery's vision is one that's still embedded in an identifiable tradition of imperial history and commercial imperial history. The well-known British artist John Wonnacott was recently commissioned to do a group portrait of the directors and CEOs of the multinational Jardine Matheson, the corporation which is a direct descendant of Jardine Matheson's early 19th century commercial enterprises. There's a direct line there from that company set up in the 1810s, 1820s, and the current Jardine Matheson. With a view looking out from a 48th floor of the Jardine building in Hong Kong as though through binoculars, and that's the exterior of the Jardine building in Hong Kong. Wannacott's painting was deliberately conceived as a homage to Chinnery's 1842 painting of On Dent's Veranda, which is quoted within Wonecott's image, and you can see it there right on the back wall in the centre. Even though that's not where it is. It's actually in a private collection in London. And this homage to Quilley's painting, which is quoted within Wonecott's image directly, seems to has an apparent blindness to the Quilley's painting dubious moral and historical associations, or simply a lack of care about them. So that's interesting in itself. Considering British culture through the filter of maritime commerce, embodied in organisations such as the East India Company or in practices such as the Atlantic slave trade, enables a significantly changed and productively changed and expanded view, in which connections can be made across a larger and more inclusive historical arena. It allows us not only to make connections across the maritime imperial world to places as far distant as the Caribbean and the China coast, but it also traces the roots from the world of Turner's, Davis's and Chinnery's paintings to present-day corporate commerce, its imperial ancestry, and the place of art and visual culture within it, where I think this is really interesting and important. Thank you very much. I'll finish there. Prego.
Che c'è molto materiale su cui riflettere, sia sul materiale visivo, sia sull'approccio metodologico con cui si legge tutta questa vicenda, no? Che è effettivamente molto molto complessa, perché questi passaggi a opere che hanno anche una dimensione antropologica inizialmente, poi però finiscono in una maniera molto, molto diversa. Io ho molte domande, però vorrei vedere se il pubblico presente e a distanza ne avesse prima di me, perché direi che sono loro che dovrebbero fare domande per primi.
Sì, ma il mio inglese è terribile, mi aiuta professoressa. My English is very terrible.
My Italian is even worse.
We have a competition.
Io vorrei ringraziarlo perché, mi ripeto nuovamente con quella mia famosa tesi, la mia tesi generale triennale era incentrata sul rapporto tra la prima grande esposizione universale di Londra e poi quello che è stato creato poi in Italia. Ma questa prima grande esposizione di Londra è un po' di anni successivi rispetto a ciò che ha mostrato il professore, era creata la discussione tra l'artigianato in cui era coinvolto sia i governanti del tempo, che non mi ricordo chi erano, scusatemi, sia Art and Crafts con John Ruskin. Ma io ringrazio di questa lezione perché mi ha fatto riflettere che probabilmente, che forse la discussione di fondo non era tanto l'artigianato se è una forma d'arte, ma ciò che veniva prodotto era prodotto dalla manodopera locale. Quindi un aspetto è lo sfruttamento della manodopera locale, l'altro aspetto è che questa manodopera produceva delle piccole opere d'arte. Quindi, essendo le colonie, essendo un possedimento, quindi qualcosa di sottomesso, come potevano emergere degli artisti se la loro condizione è la condizione di un popolo primitivo? E quindi grazie alla sua lezione io ho avuto questa dimensione del problema, quindi più che uno sguardo sul dibattito se un oggetto poteva essere qualcosa di una produzione d'arte, quanto piuttosto invece che chi produceva poteva essere un artista. Ma se chi produceva poteva essere un artista, era però una persona primitiva per loro. Quindi come poteva avere capacità così alte un po' lui? E questo lo ringrazio tanto di questo.
Do I need to translate the
but
it's not really a question. It's rather, your lecture has made her think about a BA degree at this stage, which was to do with the first world exhibition and Ruskin's reactions to what was being exhibited there. And she now realized she may be made to think about the fact that the exploitation of these people, in fact, denies them the possibility of becoming artists and being appreciated as artists. So she's very grateful because all of a sudden everything falls into place. Altre domande?
Okay, thank you. Good.
I'd like to know, I try to explain myself in English. I'd like to know why are there so many problems in displaying the slave trade? Because on the contrary, the Opium Wars period and the opium trade is richly represented. I don't know why there is still there are so many difficulties displaying this slave trade, which was one of the major trades in the British Empire period.
Indeed, it was absolutely. That's a complicated question. That's really tricky. Partly because the slave trade at its height in the later 18th century, later decades of the 18th century, before the abolition of the slave trade, didn't attract much artistic representation except for people like Agostino Brunias, who were kind of exceptions, or George Robertson. Because the attempt to represent the slave trade and the slave plantations, the slave islands of Jamaica, etc., in positive terms was so fraught and so problematic in terms of the morality of the actuality of slave trade, because in part because of the growing abolition movement. There's sort of the representation of slavery in that sense was deeply problematic. Once you get past 1807 and the Act of Abolition, the representation of plantations becomes much more prolific. And artists do go out there in representing it very positively in all sorts of ways. It's, again, a difficult project to achieve because it's so problematic. It's so problematic. And I think, but there are more representations of the slave plantations and colonies in the 1820s, 1830s in particular. And there's, throughout the 19th century, there's an increasing sort of representation of slave plantations or former slave plantations after emancipation in the 1830s. There are increasing representations of the sugar plantations as picturesque environments, you know, as landscapes, and increasingly with recourse to photography as well. And there's a wonderful book on this. I can't remember the author's name, but there is a wonderful book. It'll come to me in a sec. But around the photographic representation in the late 19th and into the early 20th century of the Caribbean, former Caribbean colonies. And yeah, there is quite a lot of representation of the opium and the opium trade, but it tends to be again quite pejorative in terms of the way that it represents Chinese in particular as either victims of the opium trade and implicitly weak because to come to opium and its enervating effects, its weakening effects, or opium becomes represented as something which is almost weaponized. It was almost used, then presents the Chinese as these sort of devious people who are going to unleash opium on the Western world, right? Whereas in fact, the reverse is entirely true. So it's a complicated one. The representations of opium certainly are more prolific in that sense, but they're equally problematic, I think, in terms of the way they represent Chinese as in terms of otherness, in a way that in different ways, but parallel ways, the way the Caribbean was represented. Does that answer your questions?
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay.
I have something myself. I wonder whether you would agree with if I said that at the root of the ambiguity that the East India Company, let's put it by its name, has in representing the Indians and the Chinese is the fact that the British and the Europeans at large have always admired those cultures. They've had a long belief, which has exhibited itself through diplomatic missions, portraits of ambassadors, even at the level of competition in copying China pottery, to make it absolutely and somehow they cannot quite treat them the way they would treat the blacks from sub-Saharan Africa. There was something there that prevented them from treating them in the same way. I've always felt, but I don't know whether I'm wrong.
No, I think you're right. There is a distinction there, although in the 17th, 18th century, or even earlier, there were ambassadorial missions from Africa as well, and you get those sort of those stories of African princes or princesses being mistakenly captured and sold into slavery, and then they redeem themselves, somehow. And so there's a whole sort of line there going on, which makes that more complex. But the representation of the African changes in the 16th century, I think, and the 17th century in particular, to become one whereby, one thinks of the image of the Magi, for example, and the Africans represented in the Magi, and that doesn't happen later on in the same way. Instead, the African gets represented in relation to the development of slavery and the slave trade, as in purely negative terms, absolutely as animalistic, as someone who is only fit for labouring and needs to be controlled, needs to be reined in. You're absolutely right. That's different in terms of the way that Indians and Chinese are represented. There's a whole culture of chinoiserie, and there's this extraordinary respect for in the Indian Mughal Empire in particular, and the culture that they have and the depth of their history and their culture. And that's one thing that William Jones and the Asiatic Society are very much concerned with. This culture, this Hindu culture, goes back far further than anything we have in Europe. It goes back beyond Homer. What do you do with that? And yet we can still see traces of it. We can still read that culture in modern day society. And that's a really interesting thing about, the length, the longevity of that tradition. But again, in the late 18th century, the whole chinoiserie admiration for Chinese culture, which is imported wholesale and sort of unthinkingly, changes with the increasing representation of Chinese as and the Chinese Empire as an empire which was despotic, which was static, which was unable to develop in the same way as Western empires, and as somehow the Chinese as being regressive, that they were stuck in a particular system, they couldn't move out of it, and that it was unequal because of its despotism. And so this admiration for China turns into something which is, again, deeply critical, and interestingly is rooted in an Orientalist discourse. You go back to Said here, and Said was absolutely right about it. It's rooted in a discourse of scholarship, of direct observation. You know, with increasing missions, with the McCartney mission to China in the 1790s, it changes completely. With that first-hand contact with China, which previously had been sporadic or denied, it changes, and it's rooted in a first direct eyewitnessing experience. So it uses that sort of mechanism again to authorize the critique of Chinese culture. And you read the stuff that's being written around the time of the Opium Wars, and the way that it's justified is just hideous. It's just horrible. We're familiar with it today, right? In terms of the way that wars in Syria or elsewhere have been justified, or Afghanistan have been justified. And with India, the same sort of thing happens. There's that culture of exchange. The early days of the East India Company's presence in India is one based around mutual exchange. And gradually, with the East India Company's military and territorial control, that turns both culturally and legislatively into something whereby the Indian population need to be controlled and subjected. And interestingly, it goes back to, you know, the way that Indian crafts and craftsmen are represented within something like the Universal Exhibition, whereby on the one hand, they're admired by British critics like Owen Jones and people like that, saying this is extraordinary craftsmanship. Yet at the same time, what's happening in India is a setting up of, or the incipient sort of setting up of art schools to train Indian artists in the ways of Western art, because they're so primitive, they're so basic, they don't have those skills. And so you get this sort of duality going on, which is really interesting. And but places India and the Indian population as something that there's people to be controlled, and people sort of who are inferior, effectively, places in hierarchical terms. Well, it's a very long-winded answer to your question, but it's a complicated one.
I have a very simple question. First of all, thank you for this talk, and I like very much the way you have woven your muslin on your look today. And
Thank you.
but there are so many threads that, of course, they need to. I'm not sure I understood completely, so I will need to read the process.
All the covers
interconnection. My question is relatively dull compared to the sophistication of your paper, but I want to ask you a question about David's depiction of the weavers. Because if I understood, you make a statement that that picture has a documentary quality to it. Because we may see the artist himself entering the room. Because you make a statement that we acknowledge his presence in following the direction of the gaze. We don't. I mean, I don't. If I remember, we don't see the artist with the tone.
No.
So that this is just an assumption. How can you make this statement that there is that this is not just an image that he took from memory or I would say imagination?
No, sorry, I should have made it more clear, because he wrote it down. He published an account of these paintings later on, called the descriptive catalogue of this series of paintings for this entire project, in which he describes this scene. And I read it at length, but I should have made it clear that these weren't my words, they were Davis's. So he obviously didn't make that clear enough. So where he does say, that this is where I entered the room. And so the figure here looking up He says he's looking directly at the doorway where I came in, and then there's the other figure at the back who's looking directly at us, and so implicitly at the artist. Yeah. So it is there in the verbal. What we've got is really usefully, which we rarely get, is an artist writing about his own works and describing them and describing what they show, which is really handy.
Well, like very much the way you have conducted testimony as from historical sources, economic history, and the cultural history, the way you conducted the way the connection between East and West was articulated and rationalized as something that harked back to the scriptures, the time, and so on. And as I was listening to you, especially from the beginning, this kind of methodology resonated with Alan Sekula Fish story. I don't know if you're familiar with this work. Okay, so this is a suggestion, if I may be one. Alan Sekula is an artist, but also an artist, but also an essayist. And he wrote in 1993 a book, which is also an installation called Fish Story.
Oh, sorry, yes, yeah. So yes, absolutely, of course I do, yes.
That is all about the middle passage,
absolutely,
the past line, knowledge that interconnects art, history, and the tournaments.
Yeah. Sorry, no, I misheard the name. I said no. No, I am familiar with that. Absolutely, and it's wonderful work. Yes. Absolutely wonderful work. Yeah. And really opens up that idea of the sea as something which is sort of displaced, is sidelined in terms of our understanding of modernity, and then draws attention to it and says, no, the sea is absolutely fundamental to what constitutes the modern world. Yeah. Thank you. No, that's yeah. And I think it's really important. Yes, as you say, doing this work, you have to go outside of art history. You can't do it just stuck within art historical textbooks or art historical discourse. You have to go to history, economics, anthropology, all these sorts of different areas. It is fundamentally interdisciplinary. It's really exciting thing to do.
What is amazing is also that the shift from, say, India represented by Zoffany, which is full of women.
Yes.
And now we're moving on to a world of men.
Yes.
At all levels.
Yeah.
And this is really very striking.
Yeah, it is. It is. Yeah. I think you're absolutely right. And I wonder whether that's got something to do. I mean, I'm thinking on top of my head here, but whether that's in parallel with the increasing military attitude towards India and the militarization of the British in India, and the separation of Indian and British populations, for example, and the treatment of women within that.
Well, there is one of those conversation pieces in which Daphne actually shows somebody from the East India Company military arm marrying a
yes, that's right.
But I mean,
Captain William Palmer.
A very dangerous painting like that.
Yeah, but not for that date.
Not for that day, yeah.
Because the idea of sort of intermarriage or taking on Indian mistresses was not frowned upon in the same way that it was from the 1790s onwards. That suddenly changes with the advent of Cornwallis, the Marquis of Cornwallis, and this regulation, this demarcation of separate spheres for Indian and British or European, and men from women, to sort of stamp out these practices of cultural exchange.
However, it makes one feel how difficult it is for art historians in Italy without this kind of historical background to become that focused in the way the British obviously are and the French. We do not have that imperial seriousness.
No.
I believe would like to say so shifty, but
It's not a shame. It's not a shame. It's good. No, it makes it more complicated. Makes it more complicated. Absolutely, yes, yeah. And it would be very interesting to talk about that further. Yes, yeah, yeah.
If there are no further questions, then thank you again. It was a great, great pleasure. Food for our minds.
I'm not too. Cool, yes. Thank you.